Happy Easter, everyone, and happy Sunday. Hope you're all doing well. We had a great little church service today. I was drafted into the church choir because my wife is the director and practice is at our home. I'm not really a singer or a choir person, but when you're married to the choir director and it's a non-Christmas performance when you don't have like 83 people showing up to practice, you get drafted and enlisted to serve. So we sang today, and my daughter played Gethsemane, a little solo on the piano, which was really fun to hear. Today's topic is actually something that happened last week. I was thinking of doing a resurrection-themed focus, but opted instead to share some thoughts, some musings on a talk that was given last week for General Conference. Overall, really enjoyed conference, always so many uplifting messages, focusing on Jesus, talking about the scriptures, helping us think through the application of doctrine and the gospel to our daily lives. Lots of good takeaways, obviously, as with any conference. There was, however, one talk that I, right way to frame this, have a little bit of concern about the way that it was presented, and I wanted to share my thoughts. And that is, if you couldn't tell by the title already, Elder Alan Haney's talk, A Living Prophet for the Latter Days. And no, I did not use his middle initial, so if you were watching last week, then you know why. Now, of course, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as a faithful temple-going, doctrine-believing member, I believe in prophets. I believe we have modern prophets. I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. I believe Russell M. Nelson is a prophet. But that kind of has some nuance to it, which I want to get into. What does it actually mean to be a prophet? And so we'll unpack that a little bit by using Elder Haney's remarks as the kind of framework through which we look at this issue and discuss what actually is a prophet. I think there is spiritual danger in having the wrong definition because we start to rely on the arm of flesh in a sense, and we let others do the thinking, and we don't develop our spiritual discernment. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in our church, where we do believe in and have, frankly, modern prophets and modern prophecy, not just what was written 2,000 years ago, is that we speaking generally, collectively, we lack the ability to see when a prophet is actually speaking as a prophet. We don't really have good criteria through which to evaluate when the spirit of prophecy is flipped on and flipped off. Anciently, the Hebrew prophets would say, "Thus saith Jehovah, thus saith the Lord," but we don't really have that as much today. And so because church members feel like they lack the ability to decide when a prophet is actually not speaking as a prophet, if you will, they default to just believing that everything is binding and official. It's the path of least spiritual resistance, you might say. And so it becomes the easy path to follow. And you've probably heard this little quip before that, Catholics believe that the Pope is infallible, but no Catholic takes that seriously. Did I say that right? That Catholics believe that the Pope is infallible, but Catholics don't really take that seriously. Whereas Mormons believe that the prophet is fallible, in other words, imperfect and so forth. But Mormons don't take that seriously. So it's like opposite ends of the spectrum, where in our faith, oh yeah, they're imperfect, they're men, they're subject to their own, biases and temptations and mistakes and foibles and everything else. But we don't actually believe that because we lack any ability to determine and discern when that's actually happening. So we recognize it in the abstract or in theory, but we fail to actually apply it in any meaningful way. Okay, so let's walk through a few statements from Elder Haney's address. And again, I'm going to use these statements as kind of the framework through which to talk about this broader idea of what is a prophet, what is prophecy, and we need to make sure that we have our definitions straight. So he says, first of all, or rather, this isn't the very beginning of his talk, but the first thing that I'll share, he says, knowing by revelation that there is a living prophet on the earth causes one to be uninterested in the debate about when a prophet when is a prophet speaking as a prophet, or whether one is ever justified in selective rejection of prophetic counsel. So he's saying, look, the fact that we have modern prophets means that we shouldn't at all be interested in this debate about, oh, is he a prophet now? Oh, is what he just said or did not prophecy? Do we follow this counsel? Do we not do that? And so he basically says, he uses this term that he uses throughout the talk. He didn't originate this term. It's been used many times before, but he uses this term prophetic counsel, right? Knowing that there's a living prophet on the earth causes one to be uninterested in the debate about when is a prophet speaking as a prophet, or whether one is ever justified in selective rejection of prophetic counsel. I think that is a completely disingenuous way to frame this debate. He's painting two ends of a spectrum that I don't think are valid. On the one hand, he says that people are questioning when is a prophet speaking as a prophet. And on the other hand, he's saying that there's this idea of like people wanting selective rejection of prophetic counsel. But those two are the same. Because someone on the first hand who is like trying to understand when a prophet is actually speaking as a prophet, what they're really trying to do is understand what is prophetic counsel versus well-intentioned counsel that isn't necessarily from God, therefore it's not prophetic. There's this attempt in Elder Haney's remarks, I feel like, and many others preceding him. He doesn't like bear the blame here or anything. It's part of our church culture. There's this trend to imbue the prophetic label into everything that is said and done, and we'll get into the water bottles in a minute, where we don't allow these fallible individuals to be fallible, and we don't allow them to have and express their own opinions. We brand everything as prophetic. And so here Elder Haney's saying, on the one hand, you're debating about when is a prophet speaking as a prophet versus not. And then on the other hand, you want to selectively reject prophetic counsel. Well, no. People who are trying to understand when a prophet is speaking as a prophet are explicitly trying to identify and follow prophetic counsel and sift it, you might say, from well-intentioned, well-informed, sincere counsel that isn't from God, and therefore one is able to accept or reject it as they please. And yet we mask all of that in this prophetic counsel label, as Elder Haney did, to say, oh, because the person we sustain as prophet, seer, and revelator said that, it is quote-unquote prophetic counsel. But that's not what prophetic counsel is. Something is not prophetic just because someone who is in a certain office said it, right? If anything, being a prophet, seer, and revelator, like any of our callings and any of our offices in the priesthood or, whatever, they're all about potential. We have the ability to rise to that, but we aren't always operating at that level. I have many duties as an elder in the church. Do I speak with authority? Am I truly acting in, my full capacity? And every instance, clearly not, right? I have my opinions and perspectives, and I seek for guidance, and I aspire to the level of the office that I have and the obligations that I have as father and husband and, baptized member and priesthood holder and possessor of the gift of the Holy Ghost and all the things. I aspire to the level I ought to attain, but that does not mean that I am always operating at that level. I am human, I am fallible, I make all kinds of mistakes, I do stupid stuff, and I say the wrong things. And so do the leaders of the church. It's like we just think, oh, once you get at that level, like, man, you've made it. You are fine. Like, you're acting prophetic all the time. We don't allow them to be human. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. So Elder Haney says, current conditions in the world have caused some to panic. As God's covenant children, we do not need to chase after this or that to know how to navigate through these troubled times. We do not need to fear. The doctrine and principles that we must follow to survive spiritually and endure physically are found in the words of a living prophet. Now, I'm going to get into the next quote in just a second, because that's when he really starts to contrast this idea about dead prophets and living prophets. And here's kind of a preface to it. He's saying that, look, things are going crazy in the world. People are trying to understand who to follow and what to do. But what we need to do to survive spiritually and endure physically are found in the words of a living prophet. And to me, that's lacking context, you might say, because while true, while we have the potential for and actually do have a living prophet to be God's mouthpiece, that doesn't mean that he's in every generation to each new people going to say all the same things again, when we've been commanded time and again, and we have scriptures and the words of past leaders and everything else, and the saints have been given countless opportunities to act upon what they've been told, and they have not. And so, as I'll mention in a minute, we're under condemnation still. We've talked about this before in past musings. And so I don't think it's necessarily true that we can only focus on the living prophet. There have been many cases when the Lord has shut up the mouth of a prophet in the scriptures and told them to stop because the people were given past opportunities and they squandered them. And so now they had to reap the whirlwind, suffer the consequences. So it's not, I don't think it's sufficient to just focus on the words of the living prophet, as in, go to General Conference, read the ensign, read the past few years of addresses, and that is the sum total of everything that we need to do to survive spiritually and endure physically. It's important. We need to look to current counsel and new revelation and prophecy. Absolutely. However, to focus on that to the exclusion, and I'm not saying Elder Haney is like, don't read the scriptures and don't, he's not saying that, but his words, if interpreted directly as he's saying them, is that what you need to follow is the words of, the living prophet. And you might say, okay, well, look, Moses had to take the, children of Israel across the Red Sea and everything else, or Jesus coming, right? And everyone's clinging to these past scriptures, and what they needed to focus on was the living, prophet, the leader at the time, to show them the way. And that's absolutely valid. But still, I don't think that we can entirely discount the past counsel that we've been given and not pay attention to, which leads us into kind of the core of this message that I got a little bit squeamish with when I heard it. So he says, I'm going to hit pause on that. We're going to get through one more thing. So he says, unlike vintage comic books and classic cars, prophetic teachings do not become more valuable with age. That is why we should not seek to use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets. Okay, so a few things going on there. I do think, in many cases, prophetic teachings become more valuable with age, in the sense that you can look back and see that those were true prophecies, that the things that they were prophesying became fulfilled. We can look back and say, that gives me confidence in him as a leader because he got it right, because that prophecy was fulfilled. Therefore, let me go read more of what he taught, and he was truly inspired and all the rest. And so as world events unfold and prophecies are fulfilled, I think that gives us more confidence in the past, and therefore those prophetic teachings, from my perspective, do become more valuable. Now, I guess what I might say is his perspective, again, like the Moses or the Jesus and the others, it's like, look to the current prophet, that's who you need, cling to the current prophet to show you the path that you need to follow. And again, like, modern, true, living, current prophets are imperative for that reason. When the time comes to say we need to go in a totally different direction, or you need to abandon all those things that you've been taught in the past because of corruption and cultural baggage and idolatry and all the rest, right? So that's one of the true roles of prophet, is to call the people to repentance, to rebuke them, to show them the path to God, and if they've kind of started wandering down other paths. But that's not really what's being said here. He's saying prophetic teachings do not become more valuable with age. That's why we should not seek to use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets. Now, I would be curious if he were to have elaborated on this point. What teachings of living prophets he believes are being dismissed by using the words of past prophets. But to me, the takeaway of what he's saying here almost is giving people permission to avoid and not really search past prophets and focus on what they are teaching us. Rather, let's just stay with the milk that we're being fed at General Conference and the feel-good messages, the uplifting stuff. Ignore all the past warnings and the rebukings and the calls to abandon our idolatry and everything else. Let's just focus on the current feel-good conferencey kind of messages. And so to me, this almost like gives people permission to go down that path and exacerbate the scriptural illiteracy that I feel that we have in our church culture in terms of like reading past prophets and prophecies and understand. Like I'm going to do a whole nother musing on the second coming. And my basic thesis is that, most of the church doesn't even think about or anticipate the second coming anymore. We've really lost that as kind of a forward-looking, anticipatory thing to guide our activities. And with some reason, right, for a long time, it's coming, and then it's not coming. And so I'll get into that in another musing. But if you contrast what Elder Haney's saying, if I can be so bold, as to take what he's saying here and contrast it against something that Jesus said, on the one hand, Elder Haney's saying prophetic teachings don't become more valuable with age. We shouldn't use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets. Then we have, Jesus said, "Behold, I say unto you that ye ought to search these things," the scriptures. "Yea, a commandment I give unto you, that you search these things diligently. For great are the words of Isaiah. For surely he spake as touching all things concerning my people, which are of the house of Israel. Therefore it must needs be that he must also speak to the Gentiles." So here's Jesus saying, go search the words of past prophets. They are more, Isaiah in particular, more valuable with age. You're going to see that what he said, he had foreknowledge of, and I gave him these visions. We've got John, we've got Nephi, we got the brother of Jared, we got all these people who've seen these amazing visions and written down portions or all of what they saw. We've got the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon that we're supposedly, supposed to be striving for, yet few of us are. Did a whole musing about that months ago. But to me, Jesus is saying here, absolutely prophetic teachings become valuable with age, and we need to search them diligently. Not just kind of more myopically and narrowly focus on reading the Liahona, as it comes out. Okay, so then Elder Haney gives what he calls a real-life parable of sorts. He says, "I love the parables used by Jesus Christ to teach gospel principles. I would like to share a real-life parable of sorts with you this morning." So if you watched the conference, you've heard this story then. It was on Saturday. And he shares a story about how he was in the cafeteria at church headquarters, and the entire first presidency, Presidents Nelson, Oaks, and Eyring, were sitting at a table with 4 seats. President Nelson invited Elder Haney to sit down in the 4th seat, and they're chit-chatting and so forth. And then President Nelson proceeds to crush his water bottle and then put the cap back on. And he explained when asked by, I think, I don't remember who. He was asked by one of his counselors why he did that. He explained, this makes it easier for the people doing the recycling. And so then Elder Haney says that both President Oaks and President Eyring proceeded to crush their water bottles. And then Elder Haney, here's what Elder Haney says, quoting from his talk. He says, "At that point, I leaned over to President Oaks and quietly asked, 'Is flattening your plastic water bottle a new recycling requirement of the cafeteria?' President Oaks responded with a smile on his face, 'Well, Alan, you need to follow the prophet.'" And then he says, this is Elder Haney speaking, "I'm confident that President Nelson was not declaring some new recycling-based doctrine in the cafeteria that day, but we can learn from the prompt response of President Oaks and President Eyring to President Nelson's example and President Nelson's attentiveness to help teach those involved a better way." So Elder Haney presented this as a real-life parable. He's saying that this should serve as an example of President Nelson's attentiveness to help teach us a better way. Now, Elder Haney himself concedes that he doesn't think President Nelson was telling us all to crush our water bottles per se. The better way that he's talking about, and the real-life parable that he's trying to teach, Elder Haney, is that we should model our behavior after and follow in the footsteps of the president of the church. And to me, this like I've seen people come to the defense of Elder Haney on social media. "Oh, he was just joking. It's a silly example. I'm like, no, I don't think so. He said that this is a parable to teach us a better way. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the parables that Jesus taught, I think most of them, maybe all of them, were rooted in like valid things that were happening in the culture at the time, that the people understood, natural incidents and circumstances. So he was using what the people were familiar with and already understood and using that to extract lessons from it. So you've got, the seeds being thrown in different types of soil. That's something that, is commonly understood, and wind scatters seeds and birds and everything else. That makes sense. You've got the labor in the vineyard, right? Like this is something that actually happens that he can build a comparison off of. Wheat and tares, right? Absolutely. That was a, natural occurrence. You've got the parable of the talents and investing and hard work and, using money. That's something that made sense. You got the Good Samaritan, right? Like all these parables, from my understanding, Jesus was using valid, actual, real-world things to teach deeper spiritual meaning. And so here we have Elder Haney presenting what he called a real-life parable of sorts, and offering an example that I think is so superficial and has no inherent worth to the story, in the sense that just because President Nelson crushed a water bottle in no way means that anyone else should do likewise. We don't get extra blessings or spiritual brownie points and gold stars for, acting like that. And one might say, oh, but it's about just, conditioning yourself to follow the prophets, so that when he asks you to do something bigger, so that when we are asked to whatever, we've habituated ourselves as people who are, and to me, that's an excuse meant to excuse our spiritual laziness that I started by talking about, that we just assume everything is from the prophets, so it's easier for us. We don't have to do the hard work. We don't have to develop a spirit of discernment. And so I think that idea that we should follow in the small things so that we'll follow in the big things is really a cop-out for trying to sift through and understand what is actually from God, and pray and seek confirmation from the Spirit and all these things. Okay, so then he says, when parents ignore the counsel of the living prophet, they not only lose the promised blessings for themselves, but even more tragically, they teach their children that what a prophet says is insignificant, or that prophetic counsel can be picked through in a smorgasbord fashion without concern for the resulting spiritual malnutrition. And again, everything he's saying hinges on prophetic counsel. He's trying to infer, as he has elsewhere in his remarks, that whatever we're told, whatever President Nelson in this circumstance says, is and constitutes inherently and automatically and immediately prophetic counsel. And I get it. It's what we're taught from a young age. Since the 80s, we got the little, it's not a hymn, what do you call it? Primary song. Follow the prophet, follow, and there's no nuance there. It's just follow. And we become conditioned into a people that, in a sense, trusts on the arm of flesh. Awesome, inspired, well-meaning, amazing flesh, but flesh nonetheless, right? These people can make mistakes. They can do things that aren't inspired of God. Church leaders from time immemorial have done so, and modern church leaders have acknowledged that fact. And yet we don't allow ourselves to believe it about the current set of church leaders. We can acknowledge the mistakes of those earlier, they were trying to figure it out, or but we don't allow ourselves to have the nuance in the present tense, because it's much easier to be an armchair quarterback, and hindsight is 2020. It's so much more difficult to sift through the muck, not the muck, that's the wrong way to say it, but sift through things today to identify what is really from God. He says, finally, some of you, Elder Haney, some of you may feel you have fallen short in your efforts to follow the counsel of President Russell M. Nelson. If that is the case, then repent. Begin again to follow the counsel of God's chosen prophet. Now, I can't speak for any of you, and I certainly have no authority to speak for the church or like anything more than just one dude sharing his musings. But how I, as a father, talk to my children about this, how I talked to my son this morning when he asked me what my musing is about today, and I was walking him through some of these thoughts, is that we don't follow the counsel of any church leader just because they're a church leader. The sole purpose of those church leaders is to point us to Christ. And to the extent that their counsel is consistent with that, to the extent that we get confirmation from the Spirit that what they are telling us is actually revelation and all the rest, then I absolutely will follow, because I believe in the importance and existence of modern prophets. But he's saying here, if you've fallen short in your efforts to follow the counsel of President Russell M. Nelson, I believe very strongly that not everything President Russell M. Nelson says and does is 100% the will of God in all cases, always and forever, without exception. Two quick examples that come to mind. One is the health procedure that shall not be named, so that this video doesn't have problems on YouTube. And when the First Presidency announced their statement and told everyone to get it, there was no exception for talking to your physician or personal circumstances, personal inspiration. It was just go get this, and it's safe and effective. And we're in this war, and everyone needs to do this. I personally don't believe that's frankly scientifically correct. I don't think the thing that I'm talking about and referring to was or is safe. I also don't think it's particularly effective. And so I think this is a case where there was a lot of, I've mentioned in a past musing some other knowledge I have about these circumstances of the church's involvement here. But suffice it to say that this is an instance in which I think leaders of the church were operating in an environment of low information and high fear, like everybody else in the world. And they were being advised by certain government officials, health officials, attorneys, and so forth. And they produced that statement. I don't personally believe that was prophetic counsel. Okay, it's just one example. Another one, when we were working on medical cannabis in Utah, trying to legalize it, and the church came out against our proposal, they sent their email out to all members of the church in Utah. First time they had ever sent an email like that, using the church email list to basically urge people to vote against the ballot proposition. So here I am kind of publicly fighting the church during this whole effort, and I'm kind of the face or the ringleader of this effort, along with some of my kind of allies and colleagues. But I'm the very public, figure here, kind of pushing the crusading for this with our organization. And when the church had a statement, when they came out with their statement of opposition, the church staff, they prepared a draft, and they presented that draft to President Nelson, who used to be long ago the president of the Utah Medical Association, which the current Utah Medical Association, they opposed what we were doing, and they have a connection to President Nelson, long-standing connection, and so they basically went to the church and enlisted them to join the opposition. And so it was at the request of President Nelson's former association. One might conclude from that perhaps the church would not have gotten involved if it wasn't President Nelson who was in charge at the time. Who knows? That's just a thought. But the church staff presented this draft and said, here's the statement that we suggest making. And President Nelson took the paper and he took a Sharpie and he crossed out a few spots and wrote on a few spots and made it even stronger in its opposition against what we were trying to do. Now, do I think that God wants people to be criminalized for using a plant that he created that can provide them, healing and strength and support? No, not in any way. I don't believe that's at all a divine position to to lock people in cages and destroy their lives and take away their kids and prevent them from getting jobs just because they use a particular plant. If anything, I believe that God has provided us this plant. If you go back to the Word of Wisdom musing that I did, and we talk a lot about that in there, I believe this is a gift from God. And so do I believe that President Nelson's counsel should have been followed, that I should have, as a good, faithful member of the church, have dropped the entire campaign, shut it all down to follow prophetic counsel? Well, no, because I don't believe that that was prophetic counsel. I believe that that was President Nelson, a physician who was trained in a certain, perspective of what is a drug and what is not, and why the FDA is so important and all the rest. I believe that was, there was this leak a few years ago about, it was Elder Gong, before he was Elder Gong, and he was giving an update to a bunch of the Quorum of the 12. It was some leaked videos from, I think it used to be called Mormon Leaks, maybe it still is, but it was this presentation that Gong gave to some of the apostles and leaders, and one of them was about, marijuana being legalized in other states, and there's a lot of ignorance expressed and shared by some church leaders, not even really understanding the issue at all. And decisions are made in that environment in which these individuals, again, well-meaning, amazing people, the potential to be and receive and share prophetic counsel 100%, the authorized messengers of God, of that I have no doubt. But that does not mean that everything they say and do is prophetic. We have to do the work. We can't just assume And that's, I feel like, what our church culture does. Joseph Smith, 1843, is writing in his journal. He says, "A prophet is not always a prophet, only when he is acting as such." And so this modern idea of follow the prophet in all things has a period at the end of it, right? Follow the prophet, period. Instead, it should have a comma. Follow the prophet, comma, when he is acting as such. Now, again, we have no standard or rubric by which to evaluate easily. Okay, is he acting as a prophet now? Oh, does he meet these 18 criteria? Oh, okay, great. He's acting as a prophet now. Let me follow this prophetic counsel, right? We don't have that. I think God probably doesn't want us to have anything like that, because the point is we have to work out our own salvation. We have to test these things. We have to pray. We have to develop the spirit of discernment. And that primary song, right? From a young age, kids are not taught to develop discernment. They're not taught to seek understanding or confirmation from the Spirit. It's just obey, follow the prophet, period. Assume that everything that the president of the church says is prophetic counsel, period. Right? And I don't know that that's what the scriptures really teach. Joseph Fielding Smith, he says, "If I should say something which is contrary to that which is written and approved by the church generally, no one is under obligation to accept it. Everything that I say and everything that any other person says must square itself with that which the Lord has revealed, or it should be rejected." And so when he's saying that something that I, as the president of the church, say that is contrary to what is in the standard works, the scriptures, right, written and approved by the church generally, which, by the way, those are dead prophets. So here Elder Haney is saying, kind of ignore the dead prophets, focus on the living prophet. But here's Joseph Fielding Smith, at the time he's the living prophet, saying, if I say anything inconsistent or whatever from the so-called dead prophets, then you don't have to accept it and it should be rejected. Harold B. Lee, he says, he's quoting 1 Corinthians 14, since, quote, "the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets," then Elder Lee continues, "whatever is announced by the presiding brethren as counsel for the church will be the voice of inspiration. But the truth or error of any uninspired utterance of an individual will have to be judged by the standard works," dead prophets, "and the spirit of discernment and inspiration that is in those who actually enjoy the gift of the Holy Ghost." He's right. We have the old dead prophets as the standard of works, and we need to develop the spirit of discernment and inspiration to understand what actually is prophetic counsel. Don't assume it all is. That's spiritual laziness, right? You're going to be one of the unprepared virgins. That's not the path I think that we should be following. And then more recently, Elder Todd Christofferson, again, I'm losing the D, Elder Todd Christofferson, he says, "Not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. It is commonly understood in the church that a statement made by one leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, not meant to be official or binding for the whole church." Well, first, he says that that's commonly understood in the church. I don't know that I can get there and agree with that, right? But even so, we're very willing to look at the past church leaders and acknowledge that. Brigham Young teaching, I'm going to do a whole musing about Brigham Young later, but he's teaching the Adam God theory, and he's pushing this idea that Adam was Heavenly Father. And of all the church leaders in the Quorum of the 12, it was Orson Pratt. It was only Orson Pratt that refused. He rejected it. He's like, no, I don't believe this is the so-called prophet is saying Joseph Smith taught this to me. He claimed it as revelation, and he's teaching this on repeated occasions to the church. And everyone's fallen in step behind this, with the exception of one apostle who stubbornly refuses to acknowledge that as doctrine. And turns out he's the one that was vindicated. And now the church, rejects and washes that under the, down the memory hole, and we don't talk about that anymore. But it is one of so many examples of prophetic fallibility, of things that are even being claimed as revelation to not, in fact, be revelation, of claims of Joseph Smith teaching me this, right, to like bolster the idea or whatever. And I'll connect that to polygamy when we talk about Brigham Young and similar practices about trying to leverage Joseph to support some of these things that Brigham was pushing. But the point is that, what is the point? What was I talking about? Oh, that Orson Pratt was the only one, right, that refused. And so again, I think we're comfortable as a church saying, oh yeah, early days of the church, it was the wild, wild west, but now we have order, and there's unity, and there's conformity, and there's correlation, and there's processes. And again, it's like looking at the children of Israel. Oh, you silly Israelites, so idolatrous. What were you thinking? Worshiping a golden calf? How could you be so stupid? We're so much more refined than they are. We're so modern. We would never do something so stupid. And yet we are, I believe, and I've shared this in past musings, we are more idolatrous than them. By the way, briefly, if you're new to all this or whatever, you can click that link, sundaymusings.org, and you can go find the past ones. You can filter down by topic. So you can search for prophet to see the other ones about prophet. You can search idolatry to find that idolatry one I just mentioned. So if you're curious and want more, you can go to sundaymusings.org. Okay, couple final quick things. Joseph Smith, this is from the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. He's reading the 14th chapter of Ezekiel. And then he writes or says, teaches this. He says, let's see. The Lord had declared by the prophet Ezekiel that the people should each stand for himself and depend on no man or men in that state of corruption of the Jewish church, that righteous persons could only deliver their own souls, applied it to the present state of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and said, if the people departed from the Lord, they must fall, that they were depending on the prophet, hence were darkened in their minds, in consequence of neglecting the duties devolving upon themselves. Here's Joseph Smith, kind of the prophet that we like to call it, the founding prophet of this modern era and dispensation, and he's rebuking the people for depending on him. And he's saying that their minds are being darkened as a consequence of neglecting the duties that devolve upon themselves. I think there's a lot of wisdom there from a dead prophet, that as amazing as President Nelson and his predecessors were and his successors will be, right? We can't depend on them. We can't follow the prophet, period. We have to follow the prophet, comma, when they're acting as a prophet, when their counsel is prophetic, when we have confirmed through the Spirit and obtained the spirit of discernment, and we've, it's consistent with the standard works and all the other things that many other church leaders have talked about. And yet remarks like Elder Haney's reduce the complexity and the nuance, you might say, to this like machine gun fire. Follow the prophet, get in line if you're not just doing everything that you're told by the president of the church, whose every utterance is prophetic counsel. I think that narrative is spiritually dangerous, again, in the sense that, as Joseph Smith said, our minds are being darkened because we're neglecting our individual duties. And we're just delegating decision-making and thinking and whatever to others. Final quote, perhaps I will share, is from, there's a lot more I could go over, but I'm going to wrap it up here. This guy, Adam Miller, religious professor, something or other. He wrote a book called Letters to a Young Mormon. And here's a quote that I like. This is both the good news and the bad news. While it's scary to think that God works through weak, partial, and limited mortals like us, the only thing scarier would be thinking that he doesn't. It's a false dilemma to claim that either God works through flawless people or God doesn't work at all. The gospel isn't a celebration of God's power to work with flawless people. The gospel is a celebration of God's willingness to work today in our world, in our lives, with people who clearly aren't flawless. To demand that church leaders, past or present, show us only a mask of angelic pseudo-perfection is to deny the gospel's most basic claim, that God's grace works through our weakness. We need prophets, not idols. Our prophets and leaders will not turn out to be who you want them to be. They are not, in fact, even what God might want them to be. But they are real, and God really can, nonetheless, work through their imperfections to extend his perfect love. I think that's a great ending point, because this can become easy to be like, where's the prophecy in the church, and why are you not, and again, I feel like a lot of this is more on us rather than the leaders of the church, because you look around, you don't really see much by way of like remarkable prophecy and revelation coming. It's more caretaking almost of the church and these incremental, things that are happening. So it can be very easy for people to look at the institutional church and the leaders thereof and criticize and point fingers and say, you're not doing X, Y, Z. I think that's the wrong approach, because ultimately I think they are an extension of us. And the scriptures clearly show that we get the prophets that we want. And that if we reject their counsel, then, the Lord will pull them back and have them focus on other things. And so ultimately I feel that having prophets is a gift from God, but it's also a test from God. And I'm thankful for prophets. I think it's amazing that God has messengers through which he can communicate, that revelation can, and in some cases certainly does, happen in our day. But I do believe that we often complicate things and mess them up along the way, just as members of the church have for millennia. And the saints often, fall below the standard that the Lord has set for them, fall below the opportunities that the Lord has in store for them. And I don't know that we're immune from that. I think we like to think that, this is the last dispensation. Everything's just going to get better and better till the end. And when you read the Book of Mormon, I don't think that's really what it says. I think we have the potential for degradation and corruption and idolatry and all the problems that other societies have. I don't think we're immune, and I don't think that we can sit on our laurels thinking that those same problems won't befall us as well. So, no, I'm not going to scrunch my water bottle because President Nelson did. I'm not going to eat Wheaties or whatever he eats for breakfast. I'm not going to assume that whatever is said or saying that the what is safe and effective, or that using a cannabis plant is problematic, or there, and I could share other stories, but the point is that I think there's nuance, and I don't think it's proper to say, because those things happen with which I disagree, I'm just going to dismiss everything. He's not a prophet. Well, no, I believe he is a prophet. And I believe that when he's acting in that capacity, that is prophetic counsel. And that's awesome. As this guy, Adam Miller, says, God is working through flawed people. That's amazing. When I read Rough Stone Rolling, I was so inspired by it, because here's this Joseph Smith kid who has all these problems, and look at what God did with him. And it's a very flawed individual. I'm like, okay, good. God can do something with me too. So I'm okay with a flawed President Nelson or Monson or Hinckley or whoever, right? And I can allow them to be human and fallible, and I can allow them to have opinions, and as leaders of a massive organization, use the resources of that organization in ways with which I disagree. Because that is their administrative capacity to, dictate the affairs of this organization. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to believe that everything is divine and from God. I believe that it's up to me in large measure to figure that out, to develop a spirit of discernment, to test what's received against, past revelations and scripture and prayer and everything else. And I envision, or I don't know, I think sometimes of what would our church culture and community look like if everyone was acting in that way. I'm not saying by any means I'm perfect at that. It's just what I kind of aspire towards. But if everyone aspired towards that, and we're all, working out our own salvation and really seeking the spirit of discernment and trying to be very intentional in everything that we do, and following prophetic counsel when it's prophetic, to me that implies much more spiritual strength. Because we're being far more dedicated and focused and intentional, rather than just assuming and taking the path of least resistance and going on our merry way. I think that produces slothful saints rather than strong saints. And I would love for our church to have strong saints, not slothful saints, especially because of the second coming and all the calamities happening. And we need one another. That's the whole point of a congregation. We need so many faithful, committed people to prepare for the bridegroom and be there to help support one another as we go through all of that. So I'll wrap it there. Hope you all have an amazing Easter. Getting dinner and family underway here shortly, so I'm going to bounce. SundayMusings.org if you've not been keeping up with any past ones or you're curious. Certainly love for you to leave a review on your favorite podcast app to help spread the word and get more people listening. I enjoy these a lot. I enjoy all of you listening. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.